The Cannibal Sisters is a story from Russia about one of history's most gruesome tragedies, the Siege of Leningrad during World War II. Today, Leningrad is known as St. Petersburg. Nazi armies surrounded Leningrad and blocked the entrance to the city for nearly 3 years. The Germans bombed it almost every day, but their most powerful weapon was hunger. German scientists calculated rates of starvation and predicted that Leningrad would eat itself within weeks. This is the story. My grandfather came from Russia. He was born in Leningrad and lived there during World War II. When we were kids, he told us many stories about his own childhood. There was one story in particular that absolutely horrified me. He told it only once, and he refused to speak about it again, but he swore that it was true. During World War II, in September of 1941, the German army had surrounded the city of Leningrad and blocked off all of the roads. Nobody could get in or get out. They called it the Siege of Leningrad, and it was one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history. Hitler was determined to seize the city, and he didn't care how many buildings that he had to destroy or how many innocent people he had to kill. In fact, his plan was to cut off all supplies and starve the entire population to death. After a year of this, over 100,000 people were dead, and the streets were littered with rotting corpses. At the time of the Siege of Leningrad, my grandfather was only 6 years old. He lived in an apartment building near the center of the city with his mother and his 2 sisters. At first he said it wasn't so difficult, but then the food began to run out, and with each passing day it became harder and harder to survive. There was barely anything to eat. Some days he managed to get a crust of bread, but other days he had to go hungry, and the city was in chaos. People began eating animals and pets. They caught stray dogs, stray cats, they ate rats. When there were no animals left, the cannibalism began. On the first floor of the building where my grandfather was living, there were 4 apartments. All of them were inhabited. My grandfather and his family lived in the first apartment. The second was occupied by a woman and her 2 sons. The third was occupied by a man and his wife. 2 middle-aged sisters who had never married were also living together, and they were in the 4th apartment. One night, my grandfather was lying awake in bed because he was unable to sleep because of the hunger. But all of a sudden, he heard terrible screams and cries for help, which woke the whole family. It sounded like they were coming from one of the neighboring apartments. His mother's name was Zenaida, and she was a very brave woman. She decided to check what was going on despite the pleas of her frightened children. She gave them instructions to lock the door and to not open it for anybody. She left the children and they did what they were told. Standing in the corridor, his mother noticed that the door of the next apartment was slightly open. This one was occupied by a woman who had the 2 sons. Zenaida walked slowly to the door and she cautiously peeked inside. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Scared to death, she ran back to her own apartment and she begged her children to let her back in. When my grandfather and his sisters opened the door, their mother burst in and slammed it shut behind her. She was out of breath and her face was pale. She got them to help her barricade the door, and only then would she tell them what she had seen. On the floor, in a pool of blood, lay a severed hand, she said. There was a sickening stench of blood, and from the apartment I could hear disgusting chomping sounds. When they heard that, the older sisters became very upset, and my grandfather, who was 6 at the time, ran to the bedroom and hid under the bed. The next day, when his mother went out into the corridor again to take a look around, she saw that the door of the next apartment was firmly closed and everything was deathly silent. After several weeks, the situation in the city improved a little bit. The Russian army managed to open up one narrow supply route, so some food was able to get through. None of my grandfather's family had died from starvation, but they were all very weak. One morning, his mother gathered together what little money they had, and they went to see if there was any food that she could buy in the streets. When she came back, she noticed that the door of the 3rd apartment was hanging on one hinge. This one was occupied by a man and his wife. Guessing what happened there, Zenaida pushed the door open and she peeked inside. In the dim light, she could only make out 2 crumpled figures lying on the floor, and most of the meat had been stripped from their bone. Sick to her stomach, she returned to her own apartment, and after telling her children the horrible news, she barricaded the door once again. However, they couldn't continue like this for long. Soon, what little food supplies they had run out. They had to get more or they would starve to death. Zenaida summoned the strength to get up and leave the apartment. No sooner had she taken a couple of steps down the corridor than she saw the door of the fourth apartment open. There were two middle-aged sisters living there, and one of them came out. The woman looked unusually good. All of the residents of the city were very thin and emaciated, but this woman looked healthy and even a little fat. She smiled and said hello, then she started walking towards Zenaida. Something about the woman set her on edge, and she began to slowly walk back away from her. Looking over her shoulder, she caught sight of the second sister who was creeping up behind her. The woman was clutching a huge axe in her hand. Zenaida let out a strangled scream. She was trapped in the corridor and there was nowhere that she could go. The two sisters closed in, licking their lips in anticipation of their next meal. As it turned out, my grandfather's older sisters saw what was happening. At that very moment, a group of Russian soldiers were passing by on the street outside. The children opened the door and called out to them, screaming and begging for them to come to their rescue. Without even thinking twice, the soldiers ran into the entrance and quickly made their way up the stairs. When they came to the first door, they saw the two fat women trying to drag a skinny woman into an apartment. The soldiers leveled their rifles and they ordered the women to stop fighting. The fat woman with the axe took a swing at the soldiers and they shot her right between the eyes. The soldiers ordered the other two women to lie down on the floor and they began questioning them. Zenaida burst into tears and she told them that the two sisters were cannibals and they had already eaten the inhabitants of two apartments and they were about to eat the tenants of a third. When the soldiers searched the other apartments and came across the half-eaten remains, they realized she was telling the truth. So the soldiers rescued my great-grandmother and her family. They ordered the remaining sister to kneel down on the ground, and she was executed on the spot. That was the punishment for cannibalism at the time. A year later, the Russian army managed to push the Germans back, and the Siege of Leningrad ended. Over 1.5 million people died, and another 1.5 million had been evacuated. But somehow, my grandfather and his family managed to survive the whole thing. After all, those two fat sisters had a lot of meat on their bones. Now that was just a story meant for entertainment. Now here are some facts. Food was strictly rationed, and the amount that a person received was based on how essential they were to the city's defenses. The most essential were soldiers and supply and factory workers. The children, the elderly, and the unemployed were at the bottom, and they were only given 3 slices of bread per day, and many were forced to survive on only 300 calories a day. They stole from one another, and both men and women sold their bodies in exchange for food. Some were so desperate that they did resort to doing the unthinkable. One Leningrad survivor described how a mother fed her 3-year-old son who had died to her daughter to keep her alive. And by some accounts, as many as 2,000 cases of cannibalism were recorded. People would be killed on the street for their food ration cards, and their bodies would be hidden in the homes of the perpetrator. Those caught in the act of cannibalism were sentenced to immediate death. Those who survived became unrecognizable to themselves. Both girls and boys started to grow facial hair because of extreme starvation. Men became impotent while women lost the ability to menstruate, and their breasts hardened and they stopped producing milk. Men and women became indistinguishable from one another because everyone looked like walking corpses. While thousands in the city starved, those in power were fine. Soviet member Nikolai Rybkovsky recorded that during the siege he ate caviar, turkey, and ham, and at one point he had eaten so much that he had to be admitted to a clinic. By late summer 1942, evacuation and starvation had reduced Leningrad's population from 2.5 million to about 750,000. It was a genocide by starvation. Since we're talking about Russia, I wanted to include one of my favorite urban legends, the Well to Hell. The Well to Hell is an urban legend about a Russian team of geologists that were drilling a borehole in a remote area of Siberia, and they had drilled down so far that they had reached hell. The legend says that as they reached a depth of about 9 to 12 miles, their drill bits started to move erratically. That led some of the scientists to believe that the center of the earth, at least at this particular point, was partially hollow, and that they had drilled into hell itself. Others believed that they had just come across a deep underground cave. They felt a blast of heat come out of the hole, and they were excited about their discovery, so they raised the drill and they dropped a variety of heat-sensitive monitors down the hole, including a microphone that lasted about 20 seconds before it melted. The heat was coming from a chamber of fire. And around this time, they also heard a weak but high-pitched sound. At first, they thought it was coming from their own equipment, but after some adjustments, they realized it was actually coming from the hole. When the engineers listened to what the microphone recorded, they couldn't believe their ears. The microphone had recorded about 20 seconds of agonized screaming. The screams were from the thousands or millions of souls suffering in hell. After this, about half of the scientists quit their jobs and they left. They were too terrified to go on because they were worried they had accidentally let loose the evil powers of hell upon the earth. They hoped and prayed that whatever was down there would stay down there. The scientists that didn't leave and decided to stay saw a bat-shaped plume of smoke fly out of the hole that night, while another version of the legend says that a winged demon flew from the hole with flames spelling out, "I have conquered," in Russian. Later that night, ambulance crews were driving around the area. They were given orders to sedate everyone that was involved with a medication that was known to erase short-term memory. That's the legend. Now let's talk about the truth. The story about the well to hell was first reported by a Christian magazine from a village in western Finland, and then TBN, or Trinity Broadcast Network, received an article from an evangelist in Texas. That article led the network to run a story called Scientists Discover Hell. A newsletter about the story was also sent out to TBN subscribers. The article even mentioned the bat-like creature that flew from the hole and off into the night. TBN is the world's largest Christian network, and accounts of the story went viral, so to speak. Unfortunately, they didn't bother to verify any of the sources, and they were responsible for the hoax becoming as big as it was. Some took it as proof of the existence of a physical hell. In 1990, Christianity Today ran a story debunking the well to hell hoax. The hole wasn't in Siberia, but on the Kola Peninsula. It's called the Kola Super Deep Borehole, and it's the deepest man-made hole in the world. They began drilling on May 24, 1970, with the goal of reaching down to 49,000 feet. The borehole is actually made up of several holes that branch out from one central hole. The deepest hole is called SG-3, and it's 9 inches in diameter, but it reaches 1/3 of the distance to the Earth's Baltic crust at 7.5 miles, or 39,578 feet below. It took them 14 years to reach this point. They had to stop because a 16,000-foot section of the drill swing twisted off and it was left in the hole, and drilling started back up later from 23,000 feet. The project ended in 1996 due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the site has been since abandoned, but it is covered up. It gave geologists a look at the structure of the Earth's crust, which is pretty interesting to me. They found fossils and rocks that were more than 2 billion years old. Regarding the recorded screams, there isn't a microphone or any other measurement tool that can withstand 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 180 degrees Celsius or 356 degrees Fahrenheit at the bottom of the hole, but they could only expect temps to reach about 100 degrees Celsius or 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Once they reached this point, the rock had greater porosity and permeability, which, along with the heat, caused the rock to become more like a plastic than a solid, and it made drilling nearly impossible. No one could find the recording of the screams until it was featured on the Coast to Coast AM radio show with Art Bell in 1998, and again in 2002 when the episode re-aired.